Welcome to Channel 17, the Town of Colonie Government Channel.
All right, thanks for coming. At 5 of 12, no one was here, so we're all. There was an excerpt from this book in the New York Times magazine in May, on the Sunday magazine, and I read it with fascination because part of the article, which is also part of the book, is sometimes the absurdity and craziness of working in the office world, and something that John does, or people who build and fix things. At the end of the day, you can sort of see what you did. I think if you work in an office, sometimes you're just lucky you got through the day sometimes. But John Whalen runs Whalen Automotive down in Crabapple Lane in Waterville, and he has little programs down there where people can come, and he shows you how to change your oil and do basic stuff. But I don't think they have book reviews down there, do you?
No, that's
so we had to bring him up here. So here's John Whalen. Tell us about the book. It's called Shop Class as Soulcraft, an Inquiry into the Value of Work.
Thanks for coming, everybody. Just a little about myself. As Joe just said, I own and operate Whalen Automotive in Waterville. A few months ago, Joe asked me to read and review Shopcraft as Soulcraft, and I did read it. In fact, I read it a couple times. But I've been fixing cars professionally since 1976. I was attracted to mechanical devices of any kind as a kid. I enjoyed taking them apart, and eventually I learned how to put them back together. And I feel very fortunate to have gotten into this work when I did. I was mentored by Frank Crump, a man who was born in 1905. He gave me a colorful glimpse into an exciting world when airplanes were brand new and travel was done mostly by train. I started working on cars when electronic devices on automobiles were limited to the radio and the 8-track. So I've seen my share of change, and I've had to grow with the industry as cleaner, more efficient cars have brought in a lot of electronics along with the mechanics in cars. I would like to mention a little something about this book. It's the chapters in Shopcraft as Soulcraft are broken up into separate headings. And at times when I'm speaking, I'll refer to the headings because they give a good little preview about what I'll be talking about next. This book has an amazing number of footnotes. They really help the reader with background as well as giving information about his sources. There's actually 23 pages of footnotes in there, and they give, as you read it, you kind of get a lot of his background, where he came from, what he did, and how he wound up where he was. So if you do read the book, I highly recommend not skipping the footnotes. I didn't fully appreciate Shopcraft as Soulcraft until the second read. On the surface, this is a very entertaining book, a reasonably easy read with a few good chuckles. On closer inspection, namely on the second read, I realized I would need to do some study if I were to do Mr. Crawford's ideas justice. During my second read, I wished for a glossary. Crawford uses common words in ways that weren't for me readily discernible. For example, when he speaks of agency, he means acting with independence. When he speaks of autonomy, he means self-enclosed, giving a law unto oneself. I was forced to use my dictionary, and as I did, I came to respect his rich understanding of words. The book seems to represent two guises of the same man, Crawford, the motorcycle mechanic, and Crawford, the PhD philosopher. He states, "The idea of autonomy denies that we are born into a world that existed prior to us. The idea that we as a society are standing on the shoulders of giants is not one that is universally grasped. It's easy to view inventions as something that popped into a single person's head in a eureka moment. The fact of the matter is that most inventions are the outcome of many people's hard work and mastery of a subject." When he speaks of agency, he refers to the independence and self-fulfillment that arises from study and practice, whether it be learning a musical instrument or consistently cutting boards to an exact measurement. In the book's introduction, Crawford writes about all the machine tools, table saws, lathes, shapers, for sale throughout the country. Most of these tools are from the now defunct shop classes at U.S. high schools. Doing away with shop class was a result of education shifting the focus towards preparing students to be knowledge workers. Crawford writes, "The disappearance of tools from our common education is the first step towards a wider ignorance of the world of artifacts we inhabit." And I fully agree with the word artifacts. Much of our infrastructure is very old. Much, if not most of the technology we use on a daily basis is a century old or older. A person visiting here from 1910 would be mostly at home in our houses. Telephones, electric lights, flush toilets, central heat, all that would be pretty much business as usual for somebody from a century ago. Further, the automobiles we drive today have much more in common with our grandparents' cars than differences. They still roll around on tires, have brakes and suspension. There's still a reciprocating gasoline engine under the hood. What Crawford is getting at is that there's still a need to fix all this infrastructure and maintain all this infrastructure out there. And he doesn't feel that it's being addressed very well by our school systems. As I read, I was reminded of the time 5 or 6 years ago when I visited an 8th grade open house with a friend. Her son's technology teacher showed us the class project, a model magnetic levitation train the class had built together. As it turns out, they'd put it together from a kit that they'd got from an education specialty company. The reason for maglev, it was the transportation wave of the future. And the way the kids were graded was on class participation and understanding of the principles involved. Needless to say, I really had a hard time staying very reserved and quiet at that open house. And I contrast this with the shop classes of my youth. Recently, my mother was cleaning out her attic, and she found it was a little bookshelf that I built in 7th grade shop class. And I saw the date on the bottom and my initials, and I was like, wow, that was pretty good. And I remember building it using a table saw and a bandsaw and a sander. I know I was graded on the project. I don't know what kind of grade I got on it. Imagine a C or a B. And I'm sure if I questioned the grade, Mr. Webb, my shop teacher, would have showed me the flaws as well as the positive attributes of this project and would have made me understand why I got the grade that I got. And it was clear to me while I was making that project that the outcome was my responsibility and my responsibility alone. So a little bit of a contrast there for me. One of these sections in the book is a briefcase for the useful arts. And Crawford speaks to the value of doing work that has a concrete objective. The lights turn on, the motorcycle runs. The final product is something that can be recognized by all. It can be recognized by the worker's boss, and the consumer. He then goes on to speak of the responsibility to his better self, the intrinsic satisfaction of a job well done. Crawford states that if the satisfaction is intrinsic and private, there's nevertheless a self-disclosing that takes place. Doing a good job becomes a moral issue. One's character can be revealed by the quality of one's work. The shortcut job doesn't sit right with the craftsperson. Crawford points to the need for correctness of one's work. He goes on to say, the moral rightness of the work cannot be judged by the worker alone. Crawford speaks of the unfailing judgment of a carpenter's level, a machinist's micrometer, exact measuring tools not open to interpretation. He further states that dealing with the judgment of reality when one's shortcomings cannot be interpreted away gives a well-founded pride that is far from the gratuitous self-esteem that education would impart to its students as if by magic. Mr. Crawford states that the two-track educational scheme, now in use in our schools, was created by the Smith-Hughes Act of 1917, which gave federal funding for manual training in 2 forms, as part of a general education and as a separate vocational program. He states that such partitioning of thinking from doing has bequeathed us the dichotomy of white collar versus blue collar. He further believes that it continues in our educational system even now, where students are taught that blue collar work is mindless and that white collar work is mental in character. Crawford makes the point that it would take courage for a high school principal to steer kids towards the trades. My own experience support this. I remember being chastised by my guidance counselor and my teachers when I told them I wanted to be an auto mechanic. And in retrospect, I recognize that my affinity for my shop teachers was based on their demonstration of real-world skills. Their classrooms, as such, they're actually, shop class literally was a shop class, concrete on the floor and machine tools all over the place, and materials in a shop in a stock room. But they tended to be highly disciplined, and the skills they intended to impart were quite concrete. You definitely knew where you stood with those guys, and you knew what it was expected of you and what you were going to be doing in class. I've often thought that various subjects could best be taught by a master of those subjects rather than by professional educators with an understanding of the subject as it applies to the curriculum. And one of the other sections in this book was what Crawford titled the separation of thinking from doing. And he states that the dichotomy of mental versus manual didn't arise spontaneously. Rather, the 20th century saw concerted efforts to separate thinking from doing. He further says, wherever the separation of thinking from doing has been achieved, it has been responsible for the degradation of work. Crawford postulates that if we can understand the process by which so many jobs get fragmented, we will be forced to recognize those areas of work that have resisted the process and identify jobs in which the human capacity might be more fully engaged. And he dwells on that to a pretty high extent in the book, because he's saying if they can't fragmentize a job, then the job remains a whole that it has to be handled by a person. A person gets to do the thinking and the doing in the job, some of the planning as well as the execution. And he's saying that that's become a pretty rare commodity in today's work world. He writes that what scientific management, as expressed by Frederick Winslow Taylor in the book, Principles of Scientific Movement, did to craftsmen is now happening to white-collar work. Scientific management sliced and diced each job and gave it back as an instruction set. In this way, the assembly line could work with people of lower skill levels. Around the same time, and that's in the teens and 20s of last century, right post-World War I, the consumer installment plans came into being. For the first time, people could buy large goods such as automobiles that they previously wouldn't have been able to afford. And it became a symbol of honor almost to go into debt, because it showed that a person was an honorable person and able to fulfill their debts. And he states that the new indebtedness was needed to keep workers at the assembly line jobs. This was a wholesale transformation of the old Puritan moralism. In an earlier century, Ben Franklin had said, "Be frugal and free." The leaders who pushed scientific management in the installment plan seem to say, "Spend and be enslaved." The principles of scientific management are now being applied to white-collar work. It's not called scientific management anymore. They've got a lot of other names for it, some of which I should have wrote down because I can't remember right now. But Crawford states that much of the rhetoric surrounding the end of shop classes assumes that we are heading to a post-industrial economy where everyone will deal with abstractions. He further states that trafficking in abstractions is not the same as thinking. The cognitive thinking elements are gleaned from the experts and made into a system or computer program and handed back to the new class of workers that he calls clerks. They are the equivalent of an assembly line worker. Just as the craftsman was replaced, so may be the professionals we now know. In another section, he talks about being the master of one's own stuff. Crawford espouses the idea of pride as something which is greatly undervalued by our economic system. People speak of opportunity costs when it comes to fixing or maintaining their own possessions. Crawford states that the idea that all our activities are equivalent once they are reduced to the abstract currency of clock time and its wage correlate removes the basis of pride in what we do. He says that it is the characteristic of a spirited man that he takes care of his own stuff. The freedom promised by a consumerist material culture where we'll be able to sit around and think or do what we like seems to backfire. People are working long hours doing boring tasks so that they can avoid dealing with the maintenance of their own stuff. This causes the modern person to be more dependent, not freer. If a person doesn't understand the technology or equipment around them, they must seek another person for everything from debugging their own computer to changing a filter in the household furnace. And Crawford has another section, and it's called The Education of a Gearhead. And a gearhead is a person who likes to work on cars and other mechanical devices. It's a slang term. And he definitely considers himself to be a gearhead. He's a guy that started working on everything he could get his hands on at a young age and was building a souped-up Volkswagen throughout his teen years. And so this building of this car was, he considers to be a large part of his education. And in this section, Crawford points out that there are many different dispositions among people. He postulates that disposition is probably more important than IQ when determining what type of work will make someone happy and satisfied. He states that there is much talk of diversity in education, but not much accommodation of the kind we have in mind when we speak about the quality of a man or woman, the diversity of disposition. Crawford advises young people to take note of the funnel that surrounds him, by which I mean the use of psychiatric drugs to medicate boys, especially against a natural bent towards action. Crawford speaks of the stochastic arts as defined by Aristotle. These are arts which involve working with a medium that has variables. The outcome is not known because there is an interaction between the doer and the medium. Crawford goes on to state, any discipline that deals with an authoritative, independent reality requires honesty and humility. He also says, I believe this is especially so of the stochastic arts that fix things, such as doctoring and wrenching, in which we are not the makers of the things we tend. Crawford writes that similarly, in art that is representational, the artist holds herself responsible to something not of her making. In other words, when you're trying to draw or paint something, it's important that your final product look like what it is that you're drawing or painting. And it's interesting because I personally never heard of the stochastic arts before as expressed this way. And I did a little Google search on it last night, and it encompasses a whole bunch of stuff. There's a whole mathematical school of thought around it, and about, I'm going to say, close to 15 different definitions of the word. So it's pretty interesting. What he says is if we succeed in the stochastic arts, we experience the pleasure that comes with progressively more acute vision. In other words, it's the back and forth between seeing and doing that enforces a learning process. You do a little bit to something, you find out what the something's reaction is, you go back and you do some more, and you find out what the something's reaction is. And as an auto mechanic, one of the things that I've constantly have to remind younger mechanics is only do one thing to the car at a time. If you're trying to figure out what's wrong with it and you change 5 things and it's fixed, you didn't learn anything because you don't know which of the 5 things fixed it. And so, that's a very interesting logical proposition that's very important in a lot of different hands-on work, that's for sure. Crawford warns that higher education for the sake of greater earning potential or a more meaningful job may be a misguided reason to seek the education. He states that he has no regrets about his studies, but for him, they apparently did not lead him to meaningful work. he does seem to have a valid point about where many U.S. jobs seem to be going. Finding a niche that cannot be outsourced seems like good security. Crawford states, the distinction between highly skilled versus less skilled work is probably giving way to the distinction between jobs that can be outsourced via the internet and those that require an actual physical presence. Perhaps the following ideas were outside of the realm of this book, but I noticed that it seems Crawford doesn't give a lot of credence to his own formal education. He has obvious ability as a writer, which was probably honed by the papers he needed to write in college. I was struck by how good a grasp of the mechanics of the English language one needs to have to create a book. And that was brought home to me when I was reading this book and trying to distill 20 minutes to a half hour's worth of talk out of it, because you could definitely, to do the book justice would take a lot more time than that if you really get into all the different points in it. So another thought, the richness of his own life experience may have a lot to do with the fact that he can switch from white collar mode to blue collar mode. So he can enjoy both conventional intellectual pursuits and scholastic pursuits as well. At one point in the Contradictions of the Cubicle section, Crawford writes of the technocratic, meritocratic view that schools help society get the skills that it needs while they help individuals get the social positions they deserve. He states that this idea, as applied to college, is primarily a post-World War II idea. Business executives at that time, many who had only a high school education or less, assumed that college graduates would make superior employees, yet there was little evidence to show that they were better at their jobs. I suspect that there are many variables at work here. One needs to look at the rigor of what was studied. I've noticed that a brain used in logical thought processes, whether developed through the study of a discipline or through the rigorous application of skills in the work world, can usually grasp new ideas better than one whose learning method has been the memorization of facts. Crawford writes about the crew versus the team. And by that he means, you know, on a job site, there's the people working there are referred to as crew. And generally speaking, in a shop or on a job site, people aren't usually asked to do something. They're generally commanded to do something. And he says that's a little bit different than the working in an office setting. So he writes about the crew versus the team, and he pokes fun at corporate team building exercises. This is actually a pretty funny section of the book and well worth a read. He states that managers are now expected to be life coaches. He compares team building in the corporate cubicle world to the idea of working with a crew in a shop or on a construction site. The difference being that the crew understands their job and they go understands their job, and the goals of the crew are obvious, such as fix a lot of cars or build this house. He believes that the need for team building is because corporate goals can be so nebulous. I personally have long had an interest in what others do for a living. Frequently, I get into conversation with my customers about all kinds of stuff, and a lot of times I ask them, what is it you do? And they go on to describe their jobs to me, and sometimes, they get all done, and I still don't quite know what it is they do. But when some people describe the length of time that they need to spend in meetings, whereby their own description, little gets done, I can only just imagine what that feels like, and it's so very interesting. Definitely an interesting comparison for sure. In the section Thinking as Doing, Crawford writes, experienced fighters know when to flee a burning building. It is not uncommon for them to leave moments before one collapses. When asked how they knew exactly when to leave, they fall back on ideas such as a sixth sense. Crawford uses this and other examples to show how strong the workings of the subconscious mind are, particularly in individuals who have worked at something for a long while. He compares this deep understanding to the more often recognized form of knowledge, facts and information. In other words, knowing how instead of knowing what. It was interesting. I was reminded of my older brother's experience that he related to me as at a time when he was a young Army lieutenant. As a background note, my brother worked all kinds of jobs, warehouse, tree cutting, worked as a truck mechanic, and all these things while going through college. So then as an ROTC officer, he was in charge of leading this platoon, and they were out on exercises, and he came upon a group of guys that were gathered around the back end of this truck where it had, wheels this tall, 2 dual rear wheels this tall, and the brake drum was glowing cherry red, and there was this amazing amount of heat coming off of it. And he said just instinctually, he screamed, "Everybody hit the dirt." And these guys being soldiers, they all did exactly what they were supposed to do, boom. They all dropped down in the dirt, and a few moments later, there was boom, boom. 2 tires exploded, and shards of rubber and metal went flying through the air. His men were impressed, and he was grateful, really, for the previous life experience beyond what was needed for that particular job. So, I could definitely spend a lot more time on the thinking as doing topic. I definitely, as an aside, would suggest reading Malcolm Gladwell's book, Blink. He dives into a lot of this stuff. In fact, as I was reading Crawford, I was reminded constantly of him, of Gladwell's writing, because there's a lot of similarities in the background thought. The next section Crawford refers to as work, leisure, and full engagement. And Crawford starts this section of the book by writing about Nadia Comaneci's thoughts after receiving a perfect score for a gymnastics routine at the 1976 Olympics. He quotes her, "During my routine and even after, I did not think it was all that perfect. I thought it was pretty good, but athletes don't think about history when making history. They think about what they are doing and how it gets done." Crawford states, "These remarks highlight an important feature of those practices that entail skilled and active engagement. One's intention is focused on standards intrinsic to the practice, rather than on external goods that may be won through the practice, typically money or recognition." And I think this is something we've all experienced, where you're, whether you spend hours researching something or a whole bunch of time disappeared while you were working in the wood shop. It's what he's referring to is the meditative state of mind that people get into when they're doing something that they do really well. And he definitely goes on to expound on the benefits of living in the moment. And for me, I can only agree. If you want to know more, I recommend this book. Thank you all for listening.
A lot of questions, hopefully. Anyone have any questions? No. Oh, well, then, thanks, John.
Oh.
I have one question.
Okay.
I think this is one of the most important topics facing our country. I know we have healthcare to talk about, but the fact that we have unemployment and we have jobs that need doing seems like a huge problem that we're not dealing with quite well, although the community college idea goes in that direction. What do you relate to that?
Yeah, I can definitely relate to that. And I'm very fortunate with the crew I happen to have in my business at this time, but at other times I've definitely struggled to fill positions, both as finding good mechanics and even as finding competent office help, somebody that can succinctly think and answer the telephone and do things like that. And I hear this from all my friends that are in the construction trades too. It's like they're always looking for talented people, and they're pretty good paying jobs. So yeah, there's definitely a weird disparity between unemployment and the amount of how often I hear people saying they need work done. So, and it's interesting because I was talking to my older brother last night, and he needs a new pipeline dug to his house, and it goes up a 45-degree slope. And he's been trying very hard to find a contractor that can dig this out and replace this pipe that was put there in the 1920s, probably by hand digging. He's found exactly one contractor that's willing to tackle the job, and because you can't go in there and do it with a machine in 15 minutes. So, yep. So I don't know the answers to that, but yep.
I have a little story that maybe pertains to this. Contrary to what you said, there are still parts of the world that shop education is being offered, namely Western Nebraska. And I had a cousin that had a career as a shop teacher. He was promoted to his level of incompetency as a superintendent.
Oh, yeah.
He had the good sense to go, no, I am a shop teacher, I always will be. Came 65, he was put out to pasture. He suddenly discovered that at 10:30 in the morning, he had run through everything he could possibly hope to do and think about for the day. He went back and begged to be rehired. Today, he's a few years younger than I, he's probably well past 75. He's still teaching shop because there's nobody else out there. Yep. It's funny, Crawford mentions that in this book, that the states that are bringing back shop class, there's a whole gap. There's of people in the employable age group, there's nobody that has the skills to teach a shop class available. So, yep, it's interesting.
What do you, I know you mentioned art a few times. How does he, or, well, forget him, how do you feel? I mean, what's the difference between like an art as a mechanic, or do you ever like do something and you say, geez, this reached a level of art for me, or it's just a mechanical, which some things are simple and, but you know what I mean, get that feeling because it's definitely an art, like painting a picture. Use that.
Yeah, I would. There's a couple times. One is if you're making a part. If something's not available and you actually, cut something out with a cutting torch and heat it up and bend it and drill a couple holes in it and make a bracket or something, that feels very artful to me. And mentioning the cutting torch, the cars we work on in upstate New York are heavily corroded, so we use the torch a lot. And a person can get good enough with a torch that they can cut a nut off of a stud and leave the threads intact. And when you do that, it feels very artful, honestly. It's like, oh yeah, that's pretty neat. So, yep, definitely. Yep.
Sounds like a lot of what we're looking for is motivation, especially motivation for the new generations coming up. Does he offer any ideas of how we do that?
No, he doesn't get into motivation very much, and I've wondered that myself because I've hired people over the years who had drastically underestimated the effort required for the position, and that seems to be a pretty common thing I've found in the trades in general. Is like, yeah, I'm going to have to stay on my feet. I'm going to have to be pretty physically fit, and some of this work is really hard. So yeah, I don't know where that motivation comes from. Truthfully, when I was younger. Many of the best mechanics were kids that had grown up on farms. And being a mechanic 8 hours a day was a piece of cake after working in a farm, so, yep, so.
When you go out to schools, sometimes you go out to schools and stuff.
Yep.
Do the schools promote this kind of things, do you think, or?
Oh.
Not in the way of the team building thing.
No.
The other way.
I'm not sure. I don't know really where they're. You mean schools that like teach mechanics?
They're called, what's it called now?
Yeah, technology class. I haven't gotten the impression that they do, although I do know my former business partner runs the shop class at South Colonie High School, and South Colonie still has a good shop class, and kids that want to learn about auto mechanics can really learn from him. He's probably 35 years into business or something like that. So, but.
Does he ever say that, do they have a lot of kids, or?
No, they don't. No. I don't know the exact numbers, but and he relates that, a lot of kids are interested, but then when they find out the level of work required, they're not so interested. So, yeah.
I mean, they're well-paying jobs, aren't they?
Yeah, auto mechanics, make a very good middle-aged or middle-class living nowadays. So, yep.
I'd like to agree with your comment about farmers. Before mechanics, a farmer had to be a competent carpenter in order to, build his farmstead. Then came, tractors, and then came electricity and plumbing.
Yep.
And they had to master all these skills because simply the density of, the community isn't enough to support these things. And today, the entire construction industry has left the farmland. You can't find a carpenter to build a house. You got to go buy a trailer, haul it in. But the farmer has to be self-reliant because the community, the economy does not support him.
Yep. Oh yeah, for sure.
Well, there's no more questions.
In this day and age, where do you, like yourself, where do
Sure.
you get these mechanics? Out of high school, or how do you learn? Job training, station?
Mostly on the job, and it's interesting because
I went to school, there were shops there.
Yeah.
In the
Yep.
Albany area.
Yep.
The other section was a shop, and that's what the students, some of these students
Yeah.
spend most of their time in a shop, or another part of the city, they would come to the south end of Albany, they would go down there, and they'd have a shop. They could live elsewhere, but they would.
Right. Yeah, like in the BOCES program. Right.
Like
Yeah.
the BOCES.
Yeah.
They didn't call it that.
Yeah.
At that time.
Sure.
Shop program.
And they don't have that anywhere near as extensively as they used to, apparently, is what I've found. And my guys learn primarily on the job. And I would have to see, even somebody that comes out of, I've had guys that have come out of 2 years at Hudson Valley, and you still end up learning an awful lot on the job as an auto mechanic. And it's a very interesting trade in that there's absolutely, all our certification is voluntary. There's no licensing required, which I find amazing. If you want somebody to clip your fingernails, they have to have a license, but you can work on somebody's brakes and steering tomorrow just by showing up, So it's kind of interesting in my mind. And so, definitely guys walking around with blue uniforms on are not all created equal as far as that goes. And so, I continue to learn on the job all the time. They come out with new stuff on cars all the while. And even with my computer diagnostic stuff, I'll go into a tool I've been using for years and find out that it does something else that I never even knew it did. And so it's pretty extensive now. So.
Is Hudson Valley geared towards the trades, like electricians?
Mm-hmm. Yes, they are. Yep.
I don't know what
Auto repair.
other repair.
Yep. They've got a general auto repair. They've got a GM specialty auto repair school, and they have auto body and auto repair. And they also have what they call construction technologies, which is overall, so you can get out and be a construction worker. And then I believe they have specific subsets of that, plumbing, electrical. Yep. So.
Well, thanks for coming, John. We really appreciate it.
Yeah. Thanks for having me, Joe. Thank you, everybody.
Very good.
Thanks a lot. Thanks.
I think Joe was